The winter of 1874 settled heavily upon Coldwater, a mill town built on industry and silence. The river that once powered the looms moved sluggishly beneath sheets of ice, and the chimneys of brick homes bled smoke into the gray sky. Yet on one January morning it was not the stillness of winter that haunted the townspeople, but the unnatural silence rising from the Whitlock residence. The family of 5, Thomas, Margaret, their daughter Clara, and sons Samuel and Edward, had not been seen since the previous evening. Their shutters were drawn, their doors locked, and yet their absence weighed upon neighbors like a stone pressing against the chest. Something about the house seemed wrong, as if it no longer contained life, but something else. When neighbors forced entry, what they found was more disturbing than violence. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned chairs, no broken glass, no blood spilled across the floorboards. Instead, supper remained laid out upon the dining table, untouched and slowly freezing. The fire in the hearth had burned low but not out, casting a faint glow across a room that felt staged for an audience that never arrived. A single candle flickered by the stairwell, its wax pooled onto the wood as though someone had lit it only hours before. The entire home seemed caught mid-breath, paused in the moment between presence and disappearance. At first, the townsfolk whispered explanations they could tolerate. Perhaps the family had been called away. Perhaps sickness had forced them to travel in the night. But the longer they lingered inside those still rooms, the more the silence grew unbearable. It was not an ordinary silence. It was dense, heavy, like standing inside a church after prayers have ceased, where echoes of words still cling to the air though no voice remains. One neighbor swore he heard a faint scratching from behind the parlor wall. Another insisted she saw a shadow move along the upstairs landing, even as the windows stayed sealed shut. Fear spread quickly through Coldwater, for the absence of bodies seemed more horrifying than finding them lifeless. The constable was called, and with him 2 town elders. They searched every room carefully, pulling open cupboards, raising floorboards, even probing the chimney flues for signs of escape. But every door was locked from within, every window latched. The cellar was bare, the attic undisturbed, yet a cold draft threaded through the hallways as though the house exhaled. The constable tried to assure the gathering crowd that answers would come with time, that perhaps the Whitlocks would walk through the door at any moment. His words were steady, but his hands trembled. By nightfall, the Whitlock house had become a gathering place of fear. Mothers clutched their children tighter, whispering prayers, while fathers carried lanterns into corners they did not wish to see. The absence of a family was something the human mind could not reason with. Death at least left its evidence, but this void, this cruel nothing, gnawed at the townspeople's sense of order. If a family could vanish without trace from a locked home, then what safety was left for anyone? In the weeks that followed, the Whitlocks' disappearance turned from shock to legend. Workers passing the house at dawn claimed to hear muffled voices like conversations held in another room. School children swore they saw pale faces watching from cracks in the shutters. And always there was that silence, but not empty, but full of weight, as though the very walls carried secrets too heavy for human ears. The Whitlock home was boarded shut by order of the town council, but the fear did not leave. It clung to Coldwater like a sickness one no prayer or law could cure. The family had not simply disappeared. They had been consumed by something greater, something that breathed through wood and stone. And though no one would admit it aloud, every villager felt the same unspoken dread. The walls themselves had taken them. The Whitlock home did not return to silence after its doors were nailed shut. Instead, the house seemed to hold a presence that unsettled Coldwater for months to come. In a town where every hammer strike and wagon wheel could be heard along the narrow streets, the boarded windows of the Whitlock place carried their own sound. Faint, steady, like a chest inhaling through unseen lungs. Neighbors swore they felt the air shift whenever they walked past it, as if the house itself adjusted its posture to watch them. It was Elias Carter, the mason who had helped build the Whitlock home 15 years before, who first confessed something peculiar. He recalled that when he worked the mortar into the parlor walls, he thought he saw moisture seep through the bricks where none should have been. It was thick and dark, almost like blood, though he quickly brushed it away and told no one. To admit such a thing was to invite ridicule, and in Coldwater, ridicule could cost a man work. But now, as the town reeled from the family's disappearance, those memories returned to him with force. Elias claimed the house had always felt wrong. Too warm in winter, too damp in summer, as though its bones belonged to something living. Children began daring one another to touch the boards after sundown. They reported vibrations as if the wood pulsed faintly under their hands. Some claimed to hear muffled scratching, the kind of sound a trapped animal makes when desperate to claw its way free. Adults dismissed such talk as childish fright, yet none could explain why the boards seemed to warp overnight, bending inward toward the dark interior. When the town council debated tearing the structure down, superstition held them back. In the 1870s, Coldwater still lived with one foot in the age of industry and the other in the old world of folk belief. To destroy the house, some whispered, would be to release what it contained. Better to leave it, sealed, a coffin of wood and stone, than risk unleashing whatever force had swallowed the Whitlocks. But there were others who pressed closer, unwilling to accept silence as answer. A young deacon named Matthew Hale volunteered to spend a night inside, hoping prayer might ease the growing hysteria. He entered with a lantern and a Bible, locking the door behind him. By morning the lock was still bolted, but when the council pried it open, Hale was gone. Only his lantern remained, lying upright on the dining table, its flame extinguished, yet the oil untouched. The townsfolk did not speak his name again except in whispers, and no further volunteers came forward. The stories multiplied as shadows lengthened. Some neighbors swore they saw flickers of light in the upstairs windows, though no fire had been lit there since the Whitlocks vanished. Others reported strange drafts seeping from beneath the door, carrying with them a faint odor of rot and iron. And always there were sounds, not loud enough to be proof, but too steady to be ignored. Breathing, scratching, sometimes even the creak of floorboards, though no human foot should have crossed them. By spring, the Whitlock house had become more than a mystery. It had become a presence, a neighbor that unsettled every soul in Coldwater. People crossed the street to avoid it, yet they could not stop glancing toward its windows, certain something glanced back. The house no longer felt like a dwelling of brick and timber, but like a body sealed and suffocating, waiting for its next breath. In the weeks after the deacon vanished, and after the boards had doubled like a second skin over the Whitlock house, the town began to remember a quiet detail they had once treated as furniture. There had been another voice inside that home, a boarder who never drew a second look. His name came back slowly like something fished up from a deep pond. Nathaniel Pryor. He had arrived on a rain-soaked evening 2 years earlier carrying a small leather case in the manner of a man who did not wish to trouble anyone. He presented himself to Thomas Whitlock as a tutor in arithmetic and Latin, paid 3 months' board in exact coins, and asked only for a modest room on the second floor with a view of the street. He was not handsome or strange or memorable. He was crisp and plain, with neat clothes and soft shoes that avoided sound. People remembered him as polite. They also remembered, once they looked harder, that they never truly saw him leave. Nathaniel's habits seemed harmless when life was normal. He woke early but did not walk the town like other men. He took meals at irregular hours and often alone. When he did appear in the daylight, it was usually under the porch eaves, watching the street as if measuring the flow of footsteps the way a miller measures the river. He spoke gently to Margaret, was patient with Clara's questions about letters, and nodded kindly to the boys without ever joining their games. Sometimes he offered to mend a hinge or quiet a draft. He had a way of touching a wall with the back of his fingers first, then laying his palm flat against it, like a physician reading a pulse. A carpenter recalled seeing him in the parlor late one evening, tapping along the baseboards in a slow pattern, counting under his breath. It looked like fastidiousness. It felt like care. No one thought to ask what he was listening for. There were small purchases that now stood out like nails shining through paint. Mary Fitch, the seamstress, sold him spools of plain black thread and an unusual number of thick needles meant for leather. Jonas Pike, the apothecary, filled orders for lye, lime, and camphor chips, which Nathaniel explained were to keep moths from his linens. The cooper who ran the sundry shop remembered him buying a narrow measuring chain and a tiny brass plumb bob, tools an architect might use, though Nathaniel never called himself one. He paid without haggling, never asked for credit, never smiled, and never smelled of pipe smoke or drink. His gloves were always clean. His hair was always at the same length. He left no trace of himself in the places where men usually shed pieces of their lives. When the constable finally asked for records, Eliza Bell, the town clerk, brought her ledgers to the council table. She could not find Nathaniel Pryor in the census for either year he was said to live there. No baptismal note, no ship's entry, no marriage license, no property transfer, no debt. Thomas Whitlock's household ledger showed rent received every month, marked not with a name but with a set of tiny, neat squares, as if the boarder's presence could be counted without being written. The script for Mr. Pryor and the one surviving receipt looked as though it had been traced slowly over another hand, and beneath the hatched loops of the P there was the faint shadow of a different letter entirely. Eliza wet her thumb and rubbed the paper. Nothing more appeared, but she looked sick afterward, as if she had touched something that did not wish to be seen. The search moved back to the Whitlock house, past the nailed boards and the air that felt like it pressed rather than moved. The men worked room by room, not for bodies now, but for the shape of a life that had walked between the family and the town unseen. In the upstairs hallway, they found the door to the boarder's room. Inside, the bed was made with severe care, the pillowcase smooth and scentless. A wash basin stood empty beside a bar of soap shaved down to corners. There were no books on the table, only a quill, a ruler, and a folded strip of paper the length of a child's forearm with tiny marks at irregular intervals. Behind the washstand, the constable noticed a thin seam where the wall did not meet the baseboard as tightly as it should. The seam traced a neat rectangle, large enough to hide a man's secrets, but not a man. They pried carefully. Dust fell like ash. The panel lifted free on hidden pins, and the smell that came out was not rot, but sharp camphor, like a room kept for a fever patient. In the hollow cavity sat a small trunk of dark wood banded with iron, its lid pinned shut with hand-cut nails driven downward from the inside, as if someone had closed it and then changed their mind about letting it open again. The lock plate bore a decorative letter P stamped backward, a craftsman's mistake or a deliberate signal. The men lifted the trunk, surprised by its weight and by a faint ticking that was not clockwork but the settling of something dense within. They carried it into the yard where the air felt cleaner. As the crowbar bit the iron, the Whitlock house gave a long groan that could have been wind through boards or something else learning to hold its breath. The lid lifted an inch and the camphor rolled out in a wave. Whatever Nathaniel Pryor truly was, he had not lived among the Whitlocks like a tenant. He had lived through them like a slow, patient instrument, and now the town stood at the edge of a mind that hid behind perfect manners, about to read what it had written in silence. The trunk from Nathaniel Pryor's hidden compartment did not burst with riches or proof of identity. Instead, it opened like the throat of something diseased, releasing the acrid bite of camphor that clawed the eyes and nose. Inside lay a careful stack of journals, their leather covers softened with oil, their pages thick and ruled by a hand too steady to belong to a man unhinged. The entries were dated irregularly, but the writing carried no rush or hesitation. Each line was written with the patience of a physician, the dispassionate cadence of a man who thought cruelty should be recorded like rainfall. The first page began not with confession, but with an equation. A column of numbers measured the seconds it took for a scream to decay into silence when carried through timber beams. The notes spoke of frequency, of resonance, of how the cries of children differed from the cries of women in both pitch and endurance. Nathaniel had written that wood remembered sound long after the ear forgot it, and that if angled correctly, walls could be taught to speak. The journals unfolded a map of torment disguised as science. One entry described placing a bird inside a hollowed wall and noting the time it took for its wings to stop striking. He measured not only the length of its suffering, but the way the plaster warped when struck by frantic bodies. He compared this to the density of human skin, estimating how long flesh might hold before collapsing into stillness. Another page documented experiments with lime mixed into mortar, calculating how much would burn skin if pressed against it. He wrote that lime, when layered thinly between bricks, created a slow fire that did not flame but ate away at whatever it touched. binding body to wall until the two became indistinguishable. But it was not only methods of destruction that filled those pages. There were diagrams of the Whitlock house itself, drawn with careful geometry. Rooms were not measured as spaces to live in, but as chambers to contain echoes. He noted how Clara's laughter traveled faster than her mother's voice, how Samuel's footsteps carried more sharply through the floorboards than his father's heavier tread. The house, he observed, was not simply shelter. It was an instrument, a living ear. He had tuned it over months, testing how voices collapsed within its corners, how breath lingered against plaster, how silence deepened in locked chambers until a person could no longer tell day from night. The most unsettling passages were not the descriptions of suffering, but the tone in which they were written. Nathaniel did not gloat. He did not revel. He observed. He measured. He compared anguish to numbers and numbers to music. One entry read, "Human endurance bends at the same ratio as green timber when exposed to heat. The body does not resist so much as it reshapes." Another noted, "The child's cry, when carried through 3 walls, produces the same effect as a violin string plucked near the bridge." A clean, aching note, repeatable. What chilled the constable and elders most was not simply the record of cruelty, but its intent. The journals were not idle scribblings of a deranged lodger. They were plans. Step by step, Nathaniel had sought to bind living beings into the framework of the house itself. He wanted the screams to become part of the mortar, the bones to replace joists, the breath to circulate through vents as permanent drafts. He wrote that a house fed by flesh would never collapse, that it would remain alive as long as the human voice could echo within its walls. He called it living architecture. As the journals were passed hand to trembling hand, each man reading felt the same sickness. The Whitlocks had not simply vanished into the air. They had been calculated into absence, their suffering absorbed by a mind that hid behind politeness and patience. Science had been twisted into an altar, and the house itself was the shrine. The journals had already crushed the town's faith in reason, but it was the discovery in the parlor wall that turned whispered fear into raw terror. As carpenters pried open a section of plaster to trace Nathaniel's diagrams, they found strands of hair, pale and fine, embedded deep inside the hardened lime. At first it looked like the nesting of some vermin, a bundle caught where it should not be. But as they pulled further, the truth revealed itself in sickening detail. The hair was human, unmistakably long and braided, woven into the wall as if threaded through the veins of the house itself. The braid carried the red ribbon Clara Whitlock had been known to wear. The men froze, tools still in hand, as if motion might wake something within the wall. They traced the braid upward and found it disappeared into plaster, only to reappear again, a few feet higher, splitting into smaller strands that crisscrossed like veins. It was not randomly trapped. It was arranged, deliberately drawn tight through the lime so that the wall carried it like sinew. Whoever had placed it there had not simply hidden the child. They had woven her into the home. As word spread, mothers pulled their children close, some weeping, others clutching their daughter's hair as though it might vanish into the walls around them. Elias Carter, the mason who had once admitted to seeing mortar bleed, whispered that this was why the house always felt alive. It had been stitched together with the essence of its victims layer by layer until it became less a dwelling than a body. He confessed that the lime mixture Nathaniel insisted upon during repairs years earlier was unlike any he had seen. Smooth, chalky, easy to press objects into without trace. Now he understood why. When the hair was brought into the open air, the ribbon still clung to its threads, stiff with dried lime but recognizable. Margaret's sister, who had traveled from a nearby town, collapsed upon seeing it. She confirmed it was Clara's. The braid had been carefully tied before her disappearance, as if Nathaniel had performed the act not in haste but with ritual precision. The investigators began to fear that each wall contained its own piece of the Whitlocks, divided and sewn until the family itself was no longer whole but scattered, transformed into structure. More cutting revealed additional strands, some bound together, others pulled apart. The arrangement was not random. It seemed to map itself to the frame of the house. At certain intersections, the hair looped around nails. At others, it twisted into knots that tightened the plaster. It was as though Clara's very being had been used as reinforcement, like rope binding timbers at sea. A child's body turned into architecture. What made the discovery more horrifying was the silence that followed. No one could explain how hair, stripped from a child's head, could be embedded so deep without tearing the scalp, without leaving pools of blood. It was as if the walls themselves had drawn it through her, strand by strand, feeding upon her until nothing remained but woven remnants. The journals hinted at such a process, noting that keratin resists decay and so carries memory longer than flesh. Nathaniel wrote that hair was perfect thread, eternal if sealed within lime, a voice without sound, a presence without body. The town council ordered the walls sealed again, unwilling to dig further. The men who had pulled the strands from plaster refused to touch them after. One swore that when he laid the braid on the ground, it twitched, as if stirred by a current of air, though there was no breeze that day. Another said he heard the faint laughter of a girl echo through the parlor, but only for a breath before it collapsed into silence. The Whitlock disappearance had begun as mystery. Now it was horror. The townsfolk no longer spoke of the family as missing. They spoke of them as absorbed, consumed, pressed into the marrow of their own home. And as they stood before the sealed boards once again, many could not help but imagine what else the walls held, waiting to be found. The hair and the plaster confirmed that the house had become something other than wood and lime. But Nathaniel's journals revealed a method far more sinister than embedding bodies into walls. His true cruelty lay not in the final act of concealment, but in the slow unraveling of his victim's sense of self. He understood that suffering was not loud, it was silence drawn to breaking point. Within his writings were precise notes on how to control breath, echo, and time, turning the Whitlock home into a chamber of despair where voices no longer served the living. He had hollowed narrow vents through the house, invisible slits carved behind plaster and disguised beneath floorboards. They linked bedrooms to the cellar, the parlor to the attic, the dining room to hidden cavities in the walls. Nathaniel noted which vents bent sound into whispers and which stretched cries into long, distorted tones. He recorded how long it took for Margaret's pleas to travel from upstairs to the hearth. how Clara's sobs reverberated until they sounded like the moan of the wind. He even calculated the number of seconds a child could scream before the throat began to tear. He wrote of silence as if it were an instrument. When the cry ceases, the house still carries its ghost. The echo is food. The living listen to what they cannot change, until their own voices die. The journals described nights where Nathaniel kept the family locked in separate rooms, forcing them to believe one another still suffered nearby. He would replay Clara's cries through vents long after her voice had gone hoarse, tricking Margaret into believing her daughter still begged for help. He marked in his notes the moment Thomas began striking the walls, calling for his wife, though he could no longer tell whether her replies were real or echoes he had been made to hear. Slowly, the Whitlock's sense of time collapsed. Morning and night lost meaning when voices circled endlessly through hollow walls. The most haunting passage described what Nathaniel called the collapse of hope. He wrote, "After the seventh day of echo, subjects no longer cry for release. They speak only to themselves. They begin to mimic the sounds they hear, not to answer, but to feel less alone. At this stage, silence can be introduced. Silence weighs heavier than pain. They will beg for sound, even the sound of their own terror." It was this method, denying them silence, then gifting it as punishment, that hollowed the Whitlocks faster than hunger or thirst. Workmen later discovered remnants of his contraptions: clay pipes hidden in corners, brass funnels nailed behind joists, even small reeds cut to alter pitch. These were not crude tools, but deliberate instruments fashioned to bend sound until it became indistinguishable from thought. The Whitlocks had not only been imprisoned by walls, they had been imprisoned by their own voices turned against them. Every prayer, every plea, every sob was returned distorted until they could no longer trust their senses. They did not know when each other lived or when each other died. What struck the investigators most was how Nathaniel measured the collapse of will, not by blood or wounds, but by the silence of speech. His notes tallied the days between cries, the hours between prayers, the minutes between footsteps pacing. He understood that the mind breaks long before the body does. When silence finally arrived, it was not a gift of peace, but a weapon sharpened to perfection. The people of Coldwater recoiled when these truths were read aloud in the town hall. Many wept openly, unable to imagine the slow suffocation of sanity endured in that house. Some muttered that it was not the devil at work, but something worse. A man who studied human pain with patience, who did not kill in haste, but in increments so methodical that even suffering became an experiment. By the end of that summer, the town no longer called the Whitlocks vanished. They called them muted. Their voices had been stolen, woven into the very air of their home, leaving only walls that seemed to breathe with what they had lost. And as the wind shifted through Coldwater's narrow streets, many swore it carried with it faint cries that no season could silence. The breaking point for the investigators came not with the strands of Clara's hair, nor with the discovery of vents designed to warp sound, but with what they uncovered in the cellar crawl space. The Whitlock home had always carried a damp chill beneath its floorboards, a space too narrow for storage and too low for standing. It was there, while following one of Nathaniel's diagrams etched in his journal, that the men pried away loose boards and lowered a lantern into the darkness. What the flame revealed sent them stumbling back as if burned. The bones were small, unmistakably belonging to a child, and arranged not as a body but as a pattern. Each vertebra of young Samuel Whitlock, only 9 years of age when last seen, had been set apart with precision. The spine was no longer a line of life but a geometric lattice, each piece fitted against the joists above like reinforcement. His ribs had been separated and angled outward, nailed delicately into beams, forming shapes that echoed the roof's pitch. His skull rested upside down at the center of the crawl space, jaw forced wide open, holding in its mouth a rusted nail that pinned it into place. It was not burial. It was construction. Samuel had been turned into architecture, his body dismantled and reused like timber. The men could not bear to linger, yet they were forced to study it, for Nathaniel's journal left instructions scrawled across the margins. He had written that the spine of a child bore the perfect ratio for weight when inverted, that ribs when splayed could bear strain equal to seasoned oak. He referred to Samuel not by name, but as material. In one chilling line he wrote, "The boy's bones resonate cleanly. They strengthen the house, yet they sing faintly when struck." Some later claimed they heard the cellar creak that night, not with the sound of settling wood, but with the brittle chime of bone knocking bone. The horror deepened when they realized the arrangement matched the very framework of the house itself. Nathaniel had turned the child into a map, each bone reinforcing weak points in the structure. It was as though Samuel's body had been rewritten into the design of the dwelling, his skeleton serving a function no child should ever serve. The investigators who witnessed it swore their stomachs knotted with nausea, not just from grief but from a sickening logic. Nathaniel had been correct. The beams where Samuel's bones were tied stood firmer than those left untouched. Cruelty had been made into craft. The discovery spread through Coldwater like a fever. Parents refused to let their children walk near the Whitlock place. Mothers kept watch through the night, whispering prayers to keep the walls of their own homes from hungering. Even seasoned laborers refused to dismantle the arrangement, claiming that if Samuel's bones were disturbed, the entire house might collapse. And perhaps worse, perhaps the house would resist, as though protecting the pieces of life it had been fed. So the bones remained there, sealed back into the darkness, hidden yet never forgotten. For the first time, the people of Coldwater spoke Nathaniel Pryor's name openly, no longer as the harmless boarder, but as a predator who had worn civility like a mask. They spoke of him not as man, but as architect of human suffering, one who turned family into framework, who saw children not as lives but as measurements. His methods went beyond cruelty. They were deliberate conversions of flesh into structure, voice into silence, memory into stone. Samuel's remains were proof. The house was no longer merely haunted. It was inhabited, its very bones human, its endurance bought by the dismantling of a child. That night, the town shunned the house more fiercely than ever before. But even from a distance, people claimed to feel it standing stronger than before, its walls rigid, its roof straight, as if the sacrifice beneath had granted it permanence. And the people of Coldwater whispered the thought none dared to voice aloud, that the Whitlock family had not simply disappeared, but had been transformed one by one into the lasting body of the house itself. The seller's revelation had already scarred the town, but it was the parlor wall that delivered the most grotesque truth of all. When carpenters returned to trace the remaining diagrams, their chisels struck plaster, softer than it should have been, as though the wall itself were breathing through damp lime. The first crack released a stench not of rot but of something preserved, sharp, chemical, heavy with camphor. The men hesitated, lanterns trembling before cutting deeper. What they uncovered silenced even the bravest among them. Set into the wall, level with the hearth, was a human face. Margaret Whitlock's features stared outward, perfectly preserved in pale plaster. Her eyes collapsed into sockets, but her mouth held wide open. The lips had been sewn into the lime itself, stretched and pinned so that the cavity of her throat became a channel leading into a narrow vent. Her body was gone, but her mouth remained as part of the structure. A grotesque aperture through which air still moved, every draft that had unsettled the neighbors, every whisper of breath felt in the hall, had passed through her frozen silence. The discovery was worse than a corpse. It was intention. Nathaniel's journal spoke of mouths as vents of memory, writing that if air could pass eternally through lips, then the presence of the person would remain. He had not simply killed Margaret, he had transformed her into a permanent organ of the house, a conduit through which the structure inhaled and exhaled. Each sigh of wind became her last breath, repeated endlessly. The men who found her recoiled, some gagging, others weeping into their sleeves. One struck the wall with his hammer in a panic, but the blow only loosened more plaster, exposing the stitches that tethered her skin into the lime-like roots. No one dared strike again. They covered her back up, as if acknowledging her presence was to risk suffocating under her eternal exhale. Word spread quickly, and soon the entire town knew. The Whitlock mother had been sealed alive, her mouth stolen to serve as the house's breath. The image haunted every woman in Coldwater. They imagined their own lips sewn open, their own voices stolen until their homes breathed for them. Children woke screaming in the night, claiming to hear Margaret whisper through the cracks of their bedroom walls. Men stopped entering the parlor entirely, swearing the air there carried warmth, as if drawn directly from lungs. It was no longer possible to call the Whitlock case disappearance. It had become desecration, a transformation of body into architecture that defied natural order. Samuel's bones gave the house strength, Clara's hair gave it binding, and Margaret's mouth gave it breath. Piece by piece, the family was stripped of humanity and turned into structure until the house itself became a living memorial to cruelty. And still, Nathaniel Pryor was nowhere to be found. The discoveries of Clara's hair, Samuel's bones, and Margaret's mouth painted a horror that went beyond cruelty. It revealed intention. Nathaniel's journals, studied deeper by the council, began to read less like experiment and more like scripture. His entries spoke of substitution, a doctrine of exchange where the living could be traded piece by piece for permanence in stone and timber. Wood rots, lime cracks, iron rusts, he wrote, but the human element bound into the frame resists. Blood binds stronger than mortar, hair weaves tighter than rope, bone endures longer than oak, flesh is the superior material. The council, sickened yet compelled, traced how each Whitlock had been dismantled not out of rage but to complete a design. Clara's hair had been braided into the plaster to serve as connective tissue. Samuel's skeleton used to reinforce beams. Margaret's mouth repurposed as a vent for breath. Each element was not random but functional, chosen with a grim logic. Nathaniel believed the body itself was the missing ingredient in architecture, the key to creating a structure that would not crumble under time. What Masons called maintenance, he called sacrifice. The journals grew darker as they described ritual gestures before each substitution. Nathaniel recorded how he prepared the walls with lime mixed not only with sand but with drops of blood. He wrote of measuring the cadence of prayers before smothering them into silence, of pressing ribbon, tooth, or fingernail into plaster so that the memory of a life was sealed along with its body. He was not building merely a home. He was consecrating a temple to endurance, using the Whitlocks as the foundation stone. Scholars who later examined the case called it an inverted liturgy, a mockery of the church's sacraments. Where baptism offered water, Nathaniel offered lime. Where communion offered bread and wine, he offered flesh and marrow. The substitution was not only physical but symbolic, a trade of human life for the illusion of permanence. To him, the Whitlocks were not victims but ingredients. He replaced the perishable parts of a house with what he called immortal fragments of man. The thought hollowed the people of Coldwater. Families began to look at their own homes with suspicion, staring at walls as though they too might breathe or whisper. Carpenters refused to take commissions for months, fearing what their beams might one day conceal. Some whispered that Nathaniel had not only sacrificed the Whitlocks, but had awakened something within the structure itself, a hunger that could call for more. The ritual of substitution explained why the Whitlock house stood stronger than others, its beams refusing to warp under damp winters. It explained the drafts that carried voices, the walls that seemed to shift, the silence that pressed heavier than any storm. The Whitlocks were gone, but their remains had not been discarded. They had been rewritten piece by piece into a house that still stood, alive in ways no one dared put into words. By the time the council grasped the true shape of Nathaniel Pryor's work, the man himself was already gone. When they forced open the door to his upstairs room, expecting perhaps a cornered animal or a corpse, they found only absence, neat and deliberate. His boots were polished by the bed, his coat hung carefully on its peg, his wash basin gleamed as if scrubbed that morning. The pillow bore no indentation of sleep. It was a room set not for living but for leaving, the kind of stillness that suggested not departure but transformation. The journals stacked in their camphor chest had ended days earlier. The last page carried no measurements, no diagrams, but a single sentence written in his clean hand. One must not live in the house. One must become the house. There was no signature, no date. The ink had dried smooth without blot or haste, as though written with absolute calm. Search parties scoured Coldwater for weeks. They tracked the roads leading out of town, asked after him at inns and way stations, scoured records at neighboring parishes. No one had seen him arrive, and no one had seen him leave. There were no tracks in the snow around the Whitlock house, no signs of forced escape. To some, it seemed as though Nathaniel Pryor had vanished as completely as the family he consumed. Yet the people whispered otherwise. They whispered that he had not gone outward but inward, dissolving into the walls he had built with such patience. Some swore they saw his shadow move between shutter cracks, passing too quickly for flesh but too deliberately for wind. Others claimed to hear a man sigh in the chimney draught, lower and heavier than Margaret's endless exhale. The sound, they said, was different, male, practiced, waiting. The council debated destroying the house then, tearing down its beams and scattering its parts into the river. But Elias Carter, the mason, warned against it. He said the structure no longer obeyed ordinary rules, that to strike it with axes might release what had been sealed inside. If Nathaniel Pryor had written himself into the walls, then tearing them down would be no act of justice. It would be an act of release. And so the house remained, boarded, breathing, its silence heavier with each passing season. Neighbors began reporting small things, missing pets, shadows at their windows, scratches at their doors that left no marks by daylight. Children walking home from school swore they heard knocking from beneath the ground, slow and steady like the measured rhythm of Nathaniel's counting hand. When parents silenced them, the children asked a question that no adult could answer. If he had become the house, how could the house ever die? The longer Nathaniel's absence stretched, the more the town felt his presence. It was as if his invisibility spread, a contagion of unease. Shopkeepers double-checked their ledgers, unsettled by blank spaces where his name should have been. Families felt sudden drafts move through their own homes, carrying with them a faint sweetness of camphor. And in the Whitlock parlor, where Margaret's sewn mouth still opened into the vent, a new sound joined the eternal exhale. A second breath, deeper, heavier, almost a reply. By autumn, Coldwater stopped speaking Nathaniel's name in public. He was no longer a man to them, but an element, as inseparable from the Whitlock house as its beams or stones, the polite boarder, the quiet tutor, the courteous guest who once blended so easily into their lives, had dissolved into a myth of architecture and cruelty. In his silence, he became louder than any criminal could. He had not fled. He had not died. He had simply vanished into the frame of his own design, a predator hidden forever in the walls of Coldwater. The Whitlock house did not collapse with time as so many expected. Instead, it endured. Each passing year seemed only to harden its frame, the beams standing straight through storms that bent neighboring roofs, the walls resisting damp that rotted every other foundation in Coldwater. Yet its survival was not a blessing. It was a curse that unfolded slowly, each new inhabitant drawn to its sturdy walls only to flee in terror before long. The first family to take possession lasted less than 2 winters. They reported the sound of voices at night muffled through plaster, sometimes familiar, sometimes unknown. The youngest child began speaking to the walls as if to siblings hiding inside. When the mother awoke to find strands of hair braided into the nursery floorboards, she gathered her belongings and left before dawn, never to return. The council tried to dismiss her stories, but those who inspected the nursery swore they felt drafts rising from cracks that had not been there before. Another tenant, a widower, moved in alone, believing himself immune to superstition. Within months, he was found wandering the street barefoot, his mouth packed with lime dust, muttering that the walls had taught him how to breathe differently. He refused to return, and the house was sealed once more. Each attempt to repair it unearthed new horrors. Tiny bones pressed into joists, strange stains that bled through fresh plaster, vents that carried whispers when the wind was still. By the turn of the century, the house stood empty more often than not. Local children dared each other to enter, claiming to hear sighs exhale through the parlor or to see a pale face reflected in upstairs windows. Workmen refused contracts to restore it, claiming their tools dulled against beams as if striking bone rather than wood. The structure resisted change as though it had been built not to shelter but to protect itself. Stories spread far beyond Coldwater. Travelers spoke of the cursed property where families vanished or lost their minds. Ministers called it proof of godless desecration, a temple to cruelty masquerading as a home. Scholars whispered of Nathaniel Pryor, the nameless boarder whose experiments with flesh and architecture were quietly buried in sealed town records. Each generation invented its own warnings, but all agreed on one point. No family ever lasted more than 3 years within its walls. By then, the Whitlock tragedy was no longer just a mystery of one family. It had become a living curse on the land itself, a house that endured not through timber and lime, but through the remains of those consumed. And with every winter that passed, the people of Coldwater felt more certain that the property would outlive them all, standing stronger, darker, waiting for another soul to mistake its endurance for safety. By the early years of the 20th century, the Whitlock house was no longer spoken of as merely haunted. It had become a symbol of dread embedded into Coldwater's history. Its boards still stood, its roof unbroken, its foundation unmoved. But its story had traveled far, whispered from town to town, until it reached the ears of reformers who sought to shape the future of housing laws. What began as local horror slowly hardened into institutional memory. When Massachusetts legislators debated new safety codes for rental homes and boarding houses, it was the Whitlock case they cited most often, though never by name in public records. The notion that hidden cavities, sealed spaces, and undocumented tenants could exist without oversight horrified officials who wished to appear modern in the new century. They drafted regulations requiring inspections of walls, cellars, and foundations before occupancy. They argued that no family should vanish into their dwelling, though the phrase was couched in bureaucratic terms. The Whitlocks, without being named, had become the unseen victims whose fate shaped policy. Masons and carpenters, too, carried the story in their own way. Trade guilds passed down warnings to apprentices. Always trust the sound of a wall, always test the strength of plaster, always measure twice for hidden voids. Though no master would openly speak Nathaniel Pryor's name, his shadow guided their caution. They told of hair woven into lime, of bones set into joists, of breath forced to serve as draft. Each warning was framed as craft, but every apprentice understood the darker truth, that houses could carry secrets heavier than stone. Local clergy attempted to reclaim the narrative, framing the Whitlock house as a cautionary tale of godless science. Sermons warned of men who replaced faith with numbers, compassion with calculation. Yet even within those sermons lingered unease, for Nathaniel's methods could not be dismissed as madness alone. He had been careful, patient, and his work endured. The parson's voice sometimes trembled as he reminded his flock. Evil does not always arrive with fire and sword. Sometimes it knocks politely, pays an exact coin, and takes a room upstairs. By mid-century, preservationists debated whether the house should be demolished or kept as a historical site. Some argued it was a monument to cruelty, one that should be erased to cleanse the land. Others, more pragmatic, insisted its endurance made it unique, an example of construction techniques worth study. In the end, indecision prevailed. The house remained standing quiet and boarded, its windows shuttered like closed eyes. Tourists arrived now and then, asking to see the place where a family had disappeared. But townsfolk gave them only directions to the cemetery. They would not point a stranger toward the house itself for fear it might take interest. Quietly, a small memorial was raised, not at the property but in the town square. A stone plaque bore only the inscription, "For the family that Coldwater lost." No names, no dates, no mention of Nathaniel. It was less remembrance than apology, a concession that the town had never been able to protect its own. Each year flowers appeared at its base, though no one ever claimed to place them. In sealed archives bound by dust and string, the journals of Nathaniel Pryor were kept locked away by order of the state. Scholars who glimpsed them spoke of diagrams that blurred anatomy and architecture, of experiments too detailed to dismiss, too monstrous to publish. They said the handwriting remained as steady on the final page as on the first, without tremor or hesitation, as if the man had never questioned what he was. Thus the Whitlock case lingered not only in legend but in the very laws, trades, and silences that shaped the century. Its bricks had outlasted the family, its walls had outlasted time, and its story had outlasted courage. The house stood stronger than before, as if waiting for another century to test the endurance of its design. By the time the 20th century drew to a close, the Whitlock house was no longer just a building. To the people of Coldwater and to those who studied its legacy from a safer distance, it had become a metaphor too heavy to carry comfortably. It was no longer seen as timber and plaster, but as a living record of what happens when cruelty learns patience. The family's disappearance, once explained away as mystery, was now understood as something more insidious. A demonstration of how a human mind, hidden behind manners and civility, could erase lives without leaving a mark that the world wished to admit. The theories about Nathaniel Pryor grew stranger as the decades passed. Some scholars insisted he had been an early pioneer of psychological torture, centuries ahead of governments who would later study sensory deprivation. Others argued that he had been less man and more ritualist, performing a kind of reverse sacrament where family bonds were not blessed but dismantled and distributed. But the most chilling theory was the one whispered in Coldwater itself, that Nathaniel had succeeded in his own substitution, that he had threaded his own essence into the walls and was still there waiting. The house, they said, was not haunted. It was inhabited. People who dared to visit in later years spoke of a pressure inside the boarded rooms, a sense of being observed not with eyes but with the weight of air. Some claimed the parlor still exhaled, carrying the faint odor of camphor, as if Margaret's mouth still worked tirelessly to push breath through a body that no longer lived. Others swore that when they pressed their ears to the walls they heard a child's faint tapping, like vertebrae striking joists in some endless pattern. And a few insisted that in the upstairs room where Nathaniel's bed still stood they heard a man's steady sighing, patient, measured as though keeping count. The horror of the Whitlock house did not lie in spectacle, but in its quiet endurance. It had stood while families fled, while laws changed, while generations died. It endured not because it was built well, but because it had been fed. It became the perfect symbol of evil hidden within normalcy. Polite, precise, orderly on the surface, while beneath the skin it devoured everything entrusted to it. In that way it mirrored the very nature of human cruelty, never announcing itself, never rushing, but growing silently, waiting for the moment to reshape others into its design. For Coldwater, the tragedy left a scar deeper than memory. The memorial stone in the square became a place where parents held their children tighter, where whispers reminded each other that safety is never as firm as walls make it seem. For reformers, the case reshaped laws, proof that hidden suffering can exist in plain sight, ignored until it becomes structure itself. For scholars, it remained an unanswered question. How far can the human mind bend before it loses recognition of life? Nathaniel's journals offered no remorse, only calm description, and that calm was more terrifying than rage. The story of the Whitlocks forces us to confront an unbearable truth, that evil does not always arrive in fire and chaos. Sometimes it lives politely beside us, paying its rent on time, speaking gently, and hiding its obsessions until it is too late. Nathaniel Pryor's crime was not only the destruction of a family, but the creation of a philosophy, a proof that suffering could be systemized into silence. He left behind no corpse, no confession, only a structure that still stands as evidence that cruelty can be made permanent. And so the house remains boarded and silent, a body of timber and plaster that once was fed with human lives. It stands as a question more haunting than any ghost story. What does it mean when evil does not die with the man but lingers, built into the walls of the world we trust? Could such a mind rise again behind another polite face, another locked door, another house that looks safe from the street? The people of Coldwater know their answer. They walk faster when they pass the lot. They teach their children never to touch the boards. They remind one another that silence can be heavier than screams. And they leave the Whitlock house alone, because to disturb it would be to ask the walls what they remember. What do you think? Could this happen again?